This video will look at the general information around the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919. So what were some of the causes of the strike? During the war years, now remember we're talking World War I, not World War II. So during the war years, labor and union movements got a lot more power because the manufacturers could not afford to have strikes. But when the war ended and so many men returned home, the power of the unions began to decrease. And that was because there was more labor than there were jobs. And so if somebody started to agitate for unions, they would simply be fired and there would be 50 guys to take their place on the job. Workers were once again paid poorly, treated badly, and forced to work in unsafe conditions. There was a movement called the One Big Union, or Weeblies. They wanted all the unions to unite under a single banner. So if you can imagine what that would mean is whether you were a pipe fitter or a steel worker or a telephone operator or a carpenter or whatever your job was, you would all actually belong to the same union. That would mean that if the carpenters, for example, went out on strike, then every other worker would also go out on strike. And this would give an enormous amount of power to the workers. Now, because the Russian Revolution had only occurred 2 years earlier, remember the Russian Revolution started in 1917. As a matter of fact, by 1919, there were still parts of the revolution that were going on. But because of that revolution, middle and upper class people around the world became frightened that the Bolshevik ideas of the revolution would come to their countries and undermine their positions of privilege. So what was going on here in Winnipeg? In May of 1919, the metal workers at Vulcan Metal Works went on strike for better wages and working conditions, and more importantly, for the right to form unions so that they could negotiate collectively. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the Hello Ladies, who were the telephone operators, were the first to join in a sympathy strike. Now, the men working for Vulcan Metal Works were part of a trade union, but the women of the telephone exchange were not. They walked off because they felt that supporting the strike was the right thing to do. By the end of the day, over 30,000 workers in Winnipeg were on strike, effectively shutting down the city. Of these 30,000, 11,000 were unionized, and the rest joined because they felt it was the right thing to do. Over the next few days, necessary work like milk delivery was allowed as long as they carried a sign saying that they were working with the permission of the strike committee. And this is what the sign looked like. So if you were driving a milk delivery truck, for example, or a horse and cart, you had to have this paper permit displayed on the side of your cart, or you had to have it with you. So now I'm going to have a look at what was going on during the strike from two different perspectives, from the strikers' side and then from the owners' side. So starting with the strikers' perspective. Women ran soup kitchens and everyone shared food and coffee. Because you got to remember, with no money coming in, they wouldn't have the ability to just run up credit or go to the store or anything like that. So they had to share what they had. There were frequent rallies and marches over the next few weeks, all of which were peaceful, and I want to really stress that. There were no violent protests. There was a newsletter that was written and printed at the Ukrainian Labor Temple. You can still see and visit the Ukrainian Labor Temple today. It is at the corner of Selkirk and Euclid, I believe. The strike leaders repeatedly called for meetings with government officials, but were refused each time. And this is an important point because we're going to come back to it from the different perspectives. So I want you to remember, the strike leaders kept calling for meetings, government officials kept refusing them. This is an image of one of the strike rallies. This one was at a place called Victoria Park. Victoria Park doesn't exist any longer. Notice that all the men are wearing hats and coats, so the fact that the speaker is wearing neither is making a political statement through his fashion. So what about from the owner's perspective? Now, the people who owned the companies were not that were being struck did not sit idly by. They formed the Committee of 1,000. Now, there's no evidence that there were that many members. In fact, the actual membership has been a closely guarded secret ever since. To this day, we are still trying to find out who all the members were. There is a list, but it is not available publicly. So this Committee of 1,000, they met frequently with the mayor and the federal minister of labor. So while the strike leaders were calling for these meetings and constantly being refused, the Committee of 1,000 had basically free access to the very people that they needed to speak with. And the result of all of these meetings was that armed jeeps were being used to patrol the streets of Winnipeg. The police. The Winnipeg police were asked to wade into the peaceful rallies and start beating people. They refused, and for this refusal, the entire force was fired. New constables were sworn in. Many were returned soldiers who disagreed with the strike. Keep in mind, there were also many returned soldiers who supported it. Other people who would have been new constables would have been the sons and nephews of the owners of the businesses, university students, and so on. These new constables were called specials. Let's look at the strike leadership. Throughout the strike, the Committee of 1,000 said in the newspapers and everywhere they could that the leaders of the strike were Eastern European enemy aliens who'd been sent to Canada to disrupt, quote, our way of life. They did not want to admit the reality that, in fact, most of the strike leaders were British-born. It was far easier to whip up hatred against enemy aliens than it was to whip up hatred against British-born men. The leaders were arrested and they were sent to Stony Mountain Penitentiary to await deportation. Most of them got deported without a trial. Leaders like J.S. Woodsworth and Fred J. Dixon took up the cause, and they were also arrested. The reason I mention these ones in particular is because they will form the first federal party that will later on become the NDP. Bloody Saturday. On Saturday, June 21st, 1919, the strikers planned a silent march to protest the proclamation of the Riot Act. The Riot Act had been enacted, and it labeled the strike as a violent insurrection, which meant that any future assemblies could be banned by law. So the silent march was a peaceful, silent march of 30,000 people down Main Street to the corner of Portage and Main. As the silent crowd approached City Hall, it became clear to the specials that they had no cause to break up the crowd. The crowd wasn't even being noisy. But at that moment, a cable car, operated by scab workers, rounded the corner onto Main and headed toward the crowd. Now, it was no accident or bad timing, as others have suggested. Then, as today, the most acrimonious city-worker relationship was with the transit drivers. Inciting their anger was meant to turn the peaceful protest into a violent one. This image is probably one of the most famous from Winnipeg's history, and as a matter of fact, if you go and take a look on Main Street outside the concert hall, there is now an art installation that looks like the overturned cable car. The appearance of the cable car felt to the strikers like the bosses had just slapped them in the face. Angered, the crowd surged toward the cable car, chased off the crew, tried to tip it over, and then set it on fire. This gave the specials and the Northwest Mounted Police on horseback an excuse to charge into the crowd. On the second sweep through the crowd, they brandished weapons and twirled their billy clubs above their heads. And on the third charge, they fired bullets into the crowd, killing Mike Sokolowski and beating many others. At least 30 were reported as injured. Now, this is my assumption here, but I'm going to assume that there were other strike-related deaths as a result of head wounds, beatings, etc., but they would never have been reported. The people would have died at home because if they'd gone to hospital, they would have been reported to the police, and that would have been a case of the families simply would not have done that. This action effectively ended the strike. At 11 a.m. on June 26th, the Winnipeg General Strike ended, and those who still had a job returned to it. At first glance, the strikers appeared to have gained nothing, but the power of standing together was demonstrated. After this, owners were more willing to deal with local unions than risk the return of the Weebleys. And the strike leadership realized that they would not affect the changes they wanted from outside the political system, so they decided to form their own political party. It was called the CCF, and that evolved into today's NDP. And that's the end of the general information around this, so make sure that you've got your notes completed on this, and then please watch the video that I have also attached to this EDSB journal entry, and complete those questions and send that one in to me as soon as you've got them done. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.